Indonesia Tanya Utama Sabone, Utama Japon, Joga. Hey, Sabone, Japon, tipping woman, Joga. Hey, tipping woman, tipping that day. Era Jamia and Jura. Tipping that you have done ego. Senator don't puma, the tipping her. Now, new message. Salve Tandia senior, you made a book to her. Tandia senior chicken, shall Kilesas, Senator Petan. Kilesas, Chia, Nivira, Pinaya, Nivira, some family of Dhamma, Kilesas, Pinaya. Hey, young lady, says a bit of pure.
Nó giống mà Kilesas phàm bộ mà luôn. Nó giống quá chả.
Nó giống Kilesas tắt đèn đi. Tắt đèn đi lâu quá cái
nó. The last talk in the series that was given on Friday dealt with the 3 cycles of suffering, how the cycles are interconnected, and how one can break through that cycle, can shatter those cycles of suffering. And in explaining the principle behind shattering those cycles of suffering, Sayadaw used the imagery of how a person would go about putting an end to a particular species of plant. One who wishes to destroy a tree must understand the principles behind that act of destruction, and only if there is a certain systematic and methodological way to do it, and if it is done along those lines, will an effective result occur. In the same way, when we are going about the task of uprooting the Kilesas, of cutting down this tree of suffering, then it would also be very useful to know a systematic method.
Tipping that the tipping Tani, Pali to Payoga to cover. Tani, a don't you who Payoga to cover. Any Tani, a don't you, you know, tipping material. Tania, New Shida, tipping Chia, Niviro, Lepaviro, Cocoa, with a Tatiali. A penema. The Zodaya TV Theo, Theo Tatiali. You allow me to do show you the Tatiali, New Year's. Hello, Ship, tipping, he will eat it about it. Vipassana yogi ale Tatiali, Senator of Yeshiva. I did that near Lolo, so Paṇḍitā Sayadaw Vipassana Theravada.
In Pali, the word for putting into action that particular method of destroying the tree is called the yoga. Of course, there are various methods that are available, and one could go about destroying a tree by uprooting it, or adding some poisonous substance to it, and so forth. The most important thing, of course, is to work in such a way, to use such a method as to cause an effective destruction of that tree. Similarly, in the process of or in the attempt made to uproot and destroy the cycles of suffering, one must also be wise enough to choose an effective, systematic method.
Vipassana yogi ye Kilesas Paṇḍitā Mapikhe Tinju Viro Kilesas Pikomia Tatane Pibida Kilesas Ego Shumavida Tata Nina Mushiva Any Nina Murega Mapikhe Jude Viro Kilesas Pikomia Shumamu Tetapo Ati Tetapo Eraga Poviro a Yipa Louis Java
Ati Tetabo.
Tati Ati Shumamu Ati.
The process of Vipassana meditation, or rather the method of Vipassana meditation, is an effective way to destroy the Kilesas. There are two aspects to this method, and one is applying the method in such a way that Kilesas do not have the chance to arise. The second aspect of the method is to cut down the Kilesas if and when they do arise.
Kilesas Velu Pini le Sure Kilesas Chia Seclevo. But if he is a grave level, Nala Yuji. Egili that is Piniaga Ulugai Ma Yesi, Nashi, and Nakausha, go say Chautana Kandadi. Adi Kandadi Ma Niaja, Nayasa, Tia, Ayun Chaupa, La Vida, Titan. Either La Vida, Titan, Ha Nindimu, Jadimu, Nandimu, Sadimu, Titimu. Segusinda Chandimus, Radicini. I did a village, Sayadaw. I own it, saying it also. Either about on air can you, Ma Kilogao, Milogao, Sally, Kanzamudi Kilomacao, Milomacao, Jalomacao, so what a Kanzamudi. A la Paṇḍitā or Kanzamu, so you ship it over.
For a start, it would be most useful to locate the place where Kilesas sprout. And that is not very difficult for us to understand, for as we know through our six senses, through the six sense doors of the ear, of the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. When the respective sense objects of sight, of sound, of smell, of taste, of tactile objects, of thought objects come into contact or impinge on the respective sense base, then very naturally, if certain conditions are present, then the respective sense consciousness will appear. And again, when the respective sense consciousness appears in conjunction with the moment of contact between the sound, the respective sense object and the corresponding sense consciousness, then again there might be certain feelings associated with that particular consciousness. At the moment of hearing, for example, a pleasant sound coming in contact with the hearing consciousness could produce a pleasant sensation that occurs during the hearing process. Similarly, when unpleasant objects or ordinary objects come into contact with the hearing consciousness, then we have respectively unpleasant feelings and neither pleasant nor unpleasant feelings which can arise respectively with the corresponding sense consciousness.
အဲ့ဒီခံစားမှုအထိဖြစ်သွားတဲ့ယုတ်တရားနာတရားတွေဟာကုသိုလ်လည်းမဟုတ်အကုသိုလ်လည်းမဟုတ်အကုန်လုံးအပြာကတတရားတွေကြီးပါပဲဖြစ်ရဖြစ်စဉ်တရားတွေကြီးပါပဲ
So at that particular point, the three elements of the receptor element, the striker element, and the ignition element, which means the respective sense base, sense object, and sense consciousness, together with the respective kind of feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, all these do not belong to the categories of wholesome or unwholesome dhammas. They are neither wholesome nor unwholesome. In Pali they are called abhyakata dhammas, which perhaps can be translated as amoral dhammas, amoral phenomena.
အဲ့ဒီတရားတွေပရိစ္ဆေသမုပ္ပါဒ်နည်းနဲ့ပြောရလို့ရှိရင်တော့ဖတ်တာကပဲစပြီးတော့ပြောပါတော့ဖတ်စပัจจยဝေဒနာဆိုတော့ဆံရံ द्वार မှာအာယုံ6ပါးလာပြီးတော့တိုက်ခတ်တော့နာဝိညာဉ်6ပါးဝိညာဉ်6ပါးနေပြီးတော့ဖတ်တာ6ပါးပေါ့ အာယုနဲ့စိတ်နဲ့ပေါင်းစုံတော့ကောင်းတာလေးတွေမြင်သွားကောင်းခံစားမှုဆိုးတာလေးတွေမြင်သွားဆိုးခံစားမှုအလယ်လအာယုလေးတွေမြင်သွားလို့ရှိရင်အလယ်လခံစားမှုဝေဒနာတွေပါနေပါတယ်ဖတ်စပัจจยဝေဒနာဆိုတာဖတ်တာလို့ဆိုအကြောင်းကြောင့်ခံစားမှုဝေဒနာ၃မျိုးဖြစ်ပါတယ်
If we were to analyze that particular moment in terms of the law of dependent origination, we would have to start with phassa, with the mental factor, the mental concomitant of contact or impingement. And that of course occurs because of the conjunction of the three elements of the receptor element, the respective sense base, the sense object, the striker element, and the ignition element, the respective sense consciousness. So when these three come into conjunction, then there is contact between the sense consciousness and the corresponding sense object. And according to the law of dependent origination, phassa or contact is the cause for vedana, for feelings to arise. So with the presence of this mental factor of contact, of impingement, we saw just now that any one of these feelings, unpleasant, pleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant, may arise.
အဲ့ဒီလိုကြုံတွေ့ရတဲ့အခါမျိုးမှာမကောင်းတာလေးတွေနဲ့ကြုံရမကောင်းတာလေးမြင်ရကြားရနားရစားရဖြစ်ရသိရမကောင်းတာတွေနဲ့ဆုံစည်းရလို့ရှိရင်ဒုက္ခဝေဒနာတွေပေါ်တတ်ပါတယ်မချမ်းသာမှုမချမ်းသာမှုတွေပေါ်လာလို့ရှိရင်အဲ့ဒါတွေမပေါ်စေချင်တိမခံနိုင်တဲ့ဒေါသဖြစ်တယ်လို့ထို့အတူမကောင်းတာတွေနဲ့ကြုံနေရတော့ကောင်းတာတွေကိုမျှော်တယ်ဒုက္ခိစုခံပတ္ထေတိဆိုတာကောင်းတာတွေမျှော်တာဒီကောင်းတာတွေမျှော်တာအဲ့မှာတဏှာဖြစ်တာပါဒုက္ခဝေဒနာဟူသောအကြောင်းကြောင့်တဏှာဖြစ်တာလေ
An unpleasant feeling arises because of the contact between the sense organ or the sense consciousness and an unpleasant sense object. So with an unpleasant sense object, there is unpleasant feeling that arises in conjunction or simultaneous with the sensing, with the sense consciousness. And at that moment, it is also very likely that because it is an unpleasant feeling, one could react to it. There could be a mental reaction to that unpleasant feeling, and that reaction could be in the form of aversion, of dislike. On the other hand, one could also be assailed by another sort of mental factor, That could be lobha, greed. Because one has come into contact with an unpleasant object and one is experiencing unpleasant feelings, there is automatically a desire or a longing for either a pleasant object or pleasant feeling. And it is also very obvious that if craving arises, then upadana or clinging will follow in its wake. And following the whole chain, the whole links, the whole succession of the links in the dependent origination, we see that from clinging that leads to existence to bhava jati, to to karma, to existence, to birth, and old age and death and so forth. So it follows that if one is unable to be with the moment of occurrence of any of the sense processes at the corresponding sense door, then one is very liable to get caught by craving, especially when one comes into contact with unpleasant objects. Then there's a longing for relief, or longing for something else better, something pleasant. This can be perfectly illustrated by pointing to a very common experience among yogis here. And it's when you sit for some time, invariably your body begins to get filled with all sorts of pain of various shapes and sizes. Sometimes there's shooting pain, and sometimes there's really hard pain, and something like pounding pain, and sometimes it's like piercing pain and throbbing pain, and all sorts of descriptions that you can make use of. It is present there. And if we are not on our toes and we get caught, we're having a nice time trying to be mindful, keeping up with the rising and falling, and everything is so nice and sweet, and suddenly there comes the pain. And for a person who is lacking in patience, or who is not on his toes, he's had it. Immediately there is aversion, there is a reaction to the pain, and there is also a wish for something better. Oh, I wish the pain wouldn't come. It's disturbing my whole meditation. I'm doing so well, nice and concentrated. What's happening? And there you are. You're caught. On the other hand, if a person is right there with the moment, watching everything that is occurring, ever ready to deal with whatever that comes, and there is a pain that arises in the body, and immediately there is a noting of that pain, then if mindfulness is sharp enough, if concentration is strong enough, then one can penetrate into the true nature of pain. One can come to understand, for example, that pain has this quality of making the mind exhausted. It exhausts the mind. It makes the mind fatigued. It tires the mind. It also has this quality of oppression. It oppresses the mind. And it is also a sensation or a feeling that comes out of a unpleasant contact with an unpleasant object. And so one comes to know the true nature of pain. And in the place of craving for something else better, there is wisdom. And wisdom has arisen in place of craving. There are some yogis who are very persevering, very brave yogis, and they continue to look at pain, maybe gritting the teeth, or maybe not so obvious, but they look at the pain very intently, and to their surprise, at times they become very dissociated from the pain. There is even the loss of this whole sense of body part. It's no longer my leg that is paining, or my ankle, or my back that's paining, but it's just a sensation and the noting mind. It's just the pain and the noting mind. And at times the non-identification with the pain, the dissociation from the pain, becomes so strong that it becomes such a great pleasure watching pain. It's an ideal object for concentration, and the mind is there with each moment of throbbing, not the least affected by it. That becomes very delicious. So what the point that the sadhava is trying to say is that if there is mindfulness at every moment, and especially at the point of contact, at the moment that contact occurs and that sensation comes into prominence, if there is mindfulness, then immediately craving will be denied the chance to infiltrate, and there will instead be a wonderful opportunity for the blossoming of wisdom.
ခန္ဓာမှုတွေပြည့်တဲ့အခါသိက္ခာစိတ်အများဆုံးထားပြီးတော့ တရားဆိုင်ချိန်လာခဲ့ပြီးတော့ဆွေးမြဲစွာရှုလို့မခံစားမှုတက်တက်ကိုကွက်ပြီးတော့ညင်းလာတယ်ဒူးကနာတာပဲပေါင်ကကြိုက်တာပဲတင်မကအောက်နာပဲဆိုတာဒီလိုမရှိတော့ဘူးပုံသဏ္ဍာန်ကြီးပြောက်သွားတာပုံသဏ္ဍာန်ကြီးပြောက်သွားရင်ဒီပုံသဏ္ဍာန်ကြီးအစွဲပြုပြီးတော့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ပဲတတ္တဝါပဲလို့ခေါ်ရတာပဲငါပဲယောက်ျားပဲမိန်းမပဲခေါ်ရတာပဲပုံသဏ္ဍာန်ကြီးမထင်ရှားတော့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တတ္တဝါငါသူယောက်ျားမိန်းမဆိုတဲ့အစွဲဟာလည်းမရှိတော့နာရာလေးနဲ့တိတာလေးနဲ့နာရာလေးနဲ့တိတာလေးဒါပဲရှိတာနာရာလေးကလည်းသဘောတက်တက်သူ့ကိုရှုသိနေတာလေးလည်းသဘောတက်တက်ဒါလေးပဲမြင်နေနာရာလည်းအာယိနာတာဒါပေမဲ့လို့စိုးရိမ်စိတ်ကြီးကြောက်စိတ်ကြီးဝင်ပြီးတော့ပေါ့လေပြင်းရွှေ့ပြောင်းရတာနာနဲ့ကောင်းလာတာနာကောင်းဆိုတာအဲ့ဒါမှယောဂီတွေမှာတွေ့ရတာအဲ့ဒီခါမှာတဏှာတွေမရှိတော့ဆိုးတွေလို့အကောင်းညှို့တာလည်းမရှိတော့ပညာတွေပဲဖြစ်နေတာပဲဆက်ပြီး
Sayadaw reiterates that a yogi who is really very diligent, activating, penetrative mindfulness very accurately on the object of observation, will be able to handle that painful situation very skillfully. As was said earlier, the more he or she concentrates on the pain, the less and less identified he will be with it. The more he will be dissociated from the pain. And indeed, when it comes to the point when all sense of form disappears, then there is no longer any person there. There's no I, there's no man, there's no woman, there's no knee, there's no back, there's no ankle, there's no arm, nothing. It's just the noting mind and the pain. Noting mind and pain. And although it may be really very painful, the yogi is not at all, not in the least affected. There's no reaction to the pain. It's just a very, very objective and selfless process going on, noting mind, noting the pain. And as Sayadaw says, we will come to appreciate the opportunity that pain presents you. You will have great gratitude for pain. And at that time, when there is non-identification and just a noting mind and the bare pain and painful sensation, at that point, you could even be so appreciative of the pain that you can indeed say that it's really very good pain. So at that point, when wisdom is having a field time, picking up all the characteristics and nature of what's happening at that moment, craving and all the other defilements do not have a chance to occur.
အဲ့ဒီမှာခန္ဓာရဲ့သဘောလေးတွေကြည့်သွားတော့အဝိဇ္ဇာကင်းသွားတယ်ဆိုတာဒါသိထင်ရှားတယ်။အမှန်တိုင်းမသိတဲ့အဝိဇ္ဇာအလွဲတွေလျှောက်ကြည့်တဲ့အဝိဇ္ဇာကင်းသွားတာ။သူကင်းသွားတော့အဆိုးတွေတော့အကောက်ပြော်တဲ့တဏှာလည်းပဲကင်းသွားတယ်။ပြီးတော့အကောက်နေကျွဲလာပြီးတော့မျောတဲ့မျောနေတဲ့တဏှာဥပါဒနဲ့ကင်းသွားတယ်။မခန္ဓာရဲ့သဘောလေးတက်တက်ကွက်တွေ့ရတော့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တ attva ငါသူယောက်ျားမိန်းမဆိုတာမရှိတော့သဘောတက်တက်မြင်နေရပြီဆိုရင်မြင်မှားတဲ့ဒိဋ္ဌိဥပါဒနဲ့ကင်းသွားတယ်ဒီနည်းနဲ့ပဲအဝိဇ္ဇာရောတဏှာရောဥပါဒရော Kilita wo Dhamma Piata, Kilita, Supasita Piata.
To connect the preceding explanation to the cycle of Kilesas, to the three aspects of the cycle of Kilesas, namely ignorance, craving and clinging, the Sayadaw further explains that at that moment of mindfulness, when wisdom is penetrating in the true nature of reality, there of course is the absence of avijja, of ignorance. Ignorance meaning the basic ignorance of not practicing, and the deluded ignorance of having misconceptions about the true nature of reality. So, and as we saw just now, craving is also absent, because since we have come to know the true nature of what pain is, and since there is no longing for something better than what is already there, there is no craving. And in the absence of craving, clinging too is absent. It cannot be there. Another aspect of clinging, that is clinging to a wrong view, is also absent. When one penetrates into that space where there is total non-identification with the pain, where there is no sense of form at all, there is a total shattering of all types of concepts. There is only the knowing mind and the painful sensation. These at that point, then it will not be possible for the defilement of clinging to a wrong view, clinging to the view that there is an I, that there is a self. That view will not be able to arise. So we see that that moment of mindfulness is sharp enough to break through this cycle of Kilesas.
Kilita won't get what it's a way on it. She enjoyed the pin and I would do can never go. The Nagore Lovan and she enjoyed the pin, I would do can never go. Sorry, you Timakan, Dodan and she enjoyed the pin and I would do can never go. Dinine, I would do come out with the Piatari. Now, you Lugo and Navo Pisi. What a kami Kudukan 11 Poro Kudu Agudugayo, Kuduga, Boadi, Jubi, and Kudugayo, the Mapiata. Come out yet is and Gilly would be come and says that Gilly that would get on the Chican and settle with that.
The next connection to make is between the cycle of Kilesa and the cycle of karma. Obviously, if the cycle of defilements do not have a chance to operate, then in the absence of avijja, in the absence of ignorance, then in the absence of ignorance and craving and aversion, then there will also be the absence of unwholesome activities, unwholesome karma that is motivated by delusion, motivated by or motivated by aversion. And again, at that moment of mindfulness, it will also not be possible for wholesome karma that will bring about rebirth in samsara, that will perpetuate samsaric existence. That sort of wholesome karma too will not be present.
Karmaမြောက်တော်ဘူးဆိုတော့ဝိပါကကိုခေါ်တဲ့ဘဝတည်လည်းပဲမလာတော့ဘူးကိလေဝတ်ပြကာမဆက်ဥပ္ပကင်းမြတ်မှာဆိုတော့ဥပ္ပကလည်းပဲအလိုလိုကင်းသွားတာပဲအဲ့တော့ဒီသုံးမျိုးထဲမှာကိလေသာတတ်ဖို့အတွက်သိရကြည့်တာပဲကိလေသာတတ်လို့ကိလေသာတည်ရင်ကိလေသာဝိမြစ်ပြတ်ရင်ကျန်တဲ့ဝိမြစ်တစ်ခုလည်းပဲအလိုလိုကင်းသွားပါတယ်သိရှင်းပါတယ်ဗျာ
The cycle of resultant being dependent on karmic activities, on the cycle of karma, will similarly be unable to operate because there is no karma that has been performed. Then the resultant of rebirth will also not be able to come into effect as a result of non-existent karma. So one can see the importance of destroying, shattering the Kilesas. Once the Kilesas are shattered at their point of entry, at their point of possible growth, of possible infiltration, then there will no longer be any chance for a connection to be made with the cycle of Kilesas, or the cycle of karma, or the cycle of resultants.
အဲ့ဒီဆိုးရတဲ့ခံစားမှုကနေပြီးတော့ဟိုဘက်တဏှာမဆက်ရအောင်လို့အဲ့ဒီခိုက်တာမှာသင်ရှားတဲ့ယုတ်တရားနံတရားတွေကိုမရှိရင်အဝိဇ္ဇာတာယာတဲ့တဏှာဥပါဒံဖြစ်တယ်အဲ့ဒီကိလေသာကိုအကြောင်းပြုပြီးတော့ကာမကိုလည်းလာမယ်ကုသိုလ်ကအကုသိုလ်ကနေလာမယ်သူ့အကြောင်းပြုပြီးတော့ဝိပါကကိုလည်းပဲလာမယ်ဘာဖြစ်လို့ဒီလိုဖြစ်ရတယ်လို့ဆိုတော့ကိလေမပြတ်ကိလေသာမပြတ်ဘူးလေတေချာတရားဆိုင်ရှင်းသားကနေပြီးတော့ဆွေးမြဲစွာမရှိတော့အမှန်တိုင်းမသိအဝိဇ္ဇာဖြစ်သွားပြီတာယာတဏှာဖြစ်သွားပြီစွဲလာဥပါဒံဖြစ်သွားပြီကိလေသာကိုမပြတ်ဘူးကိလေသာကိုပြတ်လို့ရှိရင်သူ့အကြောင်းခံပြီးတော့ကာမကိုလည်းဆက်တော့တာပဲကာမရောက်သွားလို့ရှိရင်ဘဝတည်လည်းဖြစ်တော့တာပဲအဲ့ဒါဘဝတည်ဝိမြစ်သုံးပေါ့လေဟိုသုံးပါးဆက်တော်နေပေါ့ချုပ်ပြောလို့ရှိရင်ဒီဝေဒနာမှာမရှိမှမှလို့ရှိရင်မသိလို့ရှိရင်တော့ဒါဆက်မှာရှိမှလို့သိတော့လို့ရှိရင်တော့ပြက်မှာရဲ့
Conversely, when mindfulness is not present at the moment, when, for example, this painful sensations are occurring, then inevitably there will arise avidya or ignorance, and therefore also craving for relief, craving for pleasant sensations, and also clinging that comes in the wake of craving. And that in turn will cause the mind to engage in calming activities, wholesome or unwholesome. And as you know, once karma is committed, once karma is performed, then it's just a matter of time before the results take place, the effects come into being. And therefore, the cycle of resultants is set into motion, and the resultant in rebirth will also take place in an appropriate time. The point that should be made is that Kilesas are the main culprits. You just catch hold of them right where they stick their heads in, and there you got it. You all the cycles of Kilesas, of karma, and of vipaka, of resultants.
ဒီနေရာမှာဥပမာလေးနည်းနည်းထည့်သွင်းပြီးတော့ပြောပြရစီ။ပိုးကြောင့်ဖြစ်တဲ့လူနာတစ်ယောက်ပဲစိတ်တိပ္ပံပညာရှင်တွေကကုသတဲ့အခါအဲ့ဒီယောဂပိုးတွေကိုယူပြီးတော့မွေးပြီးတော့အဲ့ဒီယောဂပိုးတွေကိုတည်စီနိုင်တဲ့ဆေးဝါးတွေပေါ့လေကြံဖန်ရတယ်တည်နိုင်တဲ့ဟာတွေနောက်ထပ်ဒီယောဂပိုးတွေကိုနှိမ်နှင်းနိုင်တဲ့ပိုးတွေမွေးရတာတည်ကြပြီဆိုလို့ရှိရင်အဲ့ဒီလူနာရဲ့ကိုယ်ထဲမှာဒုက္ခပိတတ်တဲ့ယောဂပိုးတွေကိုနှိမ်နှင်းတဲ့ဆေးတွေပေါ့လေဟုတ်လားနှိမ်နှင်းတဲ့ယောဂနှိမ်နှင်းတဲ့ပိုးပါတဲ့ဆေးတွေထိုးသွင်းလိုက်တဲ့အခါကျတော့ဒုက္ခပိတဲ့ပိုးတွေပေါ့လေတည်သွားတယ်ပေါ့တည်သွားတယ်လူကျမ်းမာလာတာပဲဒီသဘောမျိုးပဲပြီးတော့ခုနခံစားတဲ့အခိုက်အတန့်မှာအထူးကြောင့်ညထားပြီးတော့ဆွေးမြတ်စွာမရှိရင်စိတ်ဆူဆီးမှုမရတော့အတိညာဏ်မဖြစ်ဘူးမကောင်းတဲ့ယောဂပိုးနဲ့တူတဲ့ဟာဒီကိလေသာတွေပဲဖြစ်နေတာပဲနောက်ဝေဒနာနေပြီးတော့တဏှာစသည်ပေါ့ဒါဒီမကောင်းတဲ့ပိုးတွေဝင်သွားမှာဘုရားတက်မှာတမောရောမဲ့ခင်တမတတိမဲ့ခင်တမသမာဓိမဲ့ခင်တမသင်္ကပ္ပမဲ့ခင်တမတိတိမဲ့ခင်ပေါ့ခဏကိလေသာပိုးတွေကိုတည်စင်နေတဲ့ဟာလေးတွေစိတ်အစဉ်ထဲမှာထည့်ပြီးလိုက်တဲ့ခါကျတော့ဟိုဟာဒီအလိုလိုတည်သွားတာအဲ့ဒီသဘောနဲ့လည်းခတ်ဆင်နေမှာပဲ
Sayadaw has an example ready at hand again to illustrate the point. Like, as all of you are quite familiar with, there is a particular method of medical treatment that requires bacteria culture, virus culture. What happens is that the medical scientists or people working in the laboratories, they extract some samples of some very lethal bacteria or virus, and they start to cultivate or culture antibodies or antibiotics or whatever. And they make use of those antibodies to combat that disease by injecting them into patients. And when these antibodies get into the body, into the blood system, the physiological system, then they can very easily combat the very dangerous bacteria and virus, and eventually they can win the battle. They can finish off all those harmful bacteria and virus. In the practice of Satipatthana meditation, the same principle applies. When one is trying to be mindful with each moment, there are times when, in spite of our diligence and effort, we make slips. There is a slip in mindfulness, and immediately the Kilesas jump in onto us. And at that point, those Kilesas are like those very harmful virus that has entered into the physiological system. At that point, then, we can make use of these dharmic antibodies. We can activate the path factors of the Eightfold Noble Path, like we talked about, right effort, right aim, right concentration, mindfulness, and so forth. And activating these factors within ourselves, we can immediately counteract the infiltration by the Kilesas. And if one's mindfulness is strong enough, then immediately one may be able to eliminate the Kilesas.
Yogi ha kuna tripithaတရားတွေကိုဒီကိုယ်ထဲမှာစိတ်ဆင်မှာစက်ကထည့်ပေးပါများပြီဆိုလို့ရှိရင်သူကအပေါ်စီးရပြီးတော့အားများလာတဲ့အခါကိလေသာပိုးတွေထွက်ပြီးရတော့စိတ်ကြီးပြီးတော့လန်းဆန်းနေတဲ့အခါလဲအားရှိလာတယ်ထူးခြားကြီးပဲအဲ့ဒါတရားကြီးလည်းဖြစ်လာတာကိုယ်လေးလည်းပေါ့ဖြစ်လာတယ်ဟုတ်လားထူးခြားတယ်အဲ့ဒါလေးတွေယူတည်နဲ့စိတ်ဆက်နဲ့ရှိမှတ်တဲ့ယောဂီပုဂ္ဂိုလ်များ
To continue with the example that the Sayadaw has just given, a patient who has been injected with these cultured antibodies will not immediately recover from the ailment or disease that he's suffering from. It will take time, and with each dosage of treatment that he gets, with each day, he gains in strength, and his body is able to combat the infiltrating viruses. And with the gaining of strength and health, we can see that being manifested in his or her, in the patient's complexion and facial expression and so forth. Similarly, for a yogi, the activation of these path factors within him or herself, although will be extremely helpful in combating the infiltrating Kilesas, these Kilesas are not conquered overnight. It takes time, it takes diligence and perseverance and sincerity and earnestness in one's practice. And each moment of activation of the path factors within ourselves is contributing towards this eventual victory over the Kilesas. And when that happens, one can also feel it in one's own experience, when the dharmic antibodies are gaining headway in the practice, one can feel a very wholesome sense of lightness and clarity of mind. One becomes really very sensitive and perceptive to what's happening. There is a clarity of mind, an extreme lightness of mind and body, and these very wholesome effects can be experienced by the diligent yogis. And indeed, there are some yogis here who have already gone through that process, and they can testify their experience.
အဲ့ဒီလိုခန္ဓာကိုယ်အကျိုးပြုတဲ့စိတ်တွေထဲမှာခုနပိုးကောင်တွေဆိုတာမှန်ကန်တဲ့စိတ်ဖြစ်မှာခန္ဓာကိုယ်ထဲမှာဒုက္ခပေးတဲ့အကောင်တွေကိုနှိမ့်နှိမ့်နိုင်တဲ့မှန်ကန်တဲ့စိတ်ဖြစ်ဖို့အရေးကြီးပါတယ်မမှန်ကန်တဲ့စိတ်ကိုမှန်ကန်တယ်လို့ယူဆပြီးတော့အခုသာခံလိုက်မယ်ဆိုရင်ကိုယ်ထဲကရှိနေတဲ့ဒုက္ခပေးတဲ့အကောင်တွေနဲ့နောက်ထပ်ဆေးထဲမှာပါသွားတဲ့ဟာတွေနဲ့ပူးပေါင်းပြီးတော့ဒုက္ခမရောက်ဖို့လည်းသိအရေးကြီးတယ်
A point that should be noted here is that it's very important that the antibodies introduced into the physiological system are the right ones. If one happens to give a wrong dosage or wrong species of antibodies to a patient, then very likely the wrong antibodies will become allies with the viruses in the body and further aggravate the illness of that particular patient. And in fact, it may be very fatal to his or her health. Similarly, one can apply the same implications. One can extend the same implications to the practice of meditation.
Yeah, when I go in the see them, poor a year to 11 years, a year. I see the poor 11, I see the poor 11 here. Dalove Kurema see the Kilita Muradigo, pouring Pechayama. Say my in Azuli, Mia with the easy. Tata, Sanda, Uriya, Tita Mari, Penyao, I. Elari Miao, Elari 11, Akau with the easy. Elariga Miao, Aga 11 Masibu solution, or Kilita, now so food with 12 food and a big canida. And I never did how they eat.
Another point to bear in mind is that the antibodies that are introduced into the system, into the body system, need to be antibodies which are strong enough, have required strength, and required dosage must be given. If there is a mistake in the dosage, or if the strength of these antibodies are not up to the mark, then they will be quite helpless in bringing about any relief in the patient. They will be quite helpless in overcoming the illness, in curing the disease. So too, in meditation, it is very important to have energy and faith and this very wholesome desire and chanda avirya, and also mindfulness, concentration and wisdom. All these two should be present with during our practice. If these are not balanced, are not in the appropriate quantity and quality, are not of the appropriate quality, then it is unlikely that we can win the battle with the Kilesas.
စိတ်ရဲ့ဆွမ်းရည်တတ်ကြီးကိုသိသလောက်သိရယုံကြည်သလောက်တော့ယုံကြည်ပါတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့လို့အချိန်မှန်မှအတိုင်းအတာမှန်မှမပြီးဝဲဘူးအခုတမခံဘူးဆိုလို့ရှိရင်လည်းပဲဒါလည်းမဖြစ်ပြအောင်ပြတ်တောင်းနဲ့အချိန်မှန်လုံနေလို့ရှိရင်နောက်တော့ဒီစိတ်ကကိုယ်တွေကယောဂပိုးတွေကိုတစ်ဆက်တည်းမနေနှင်းတော့ကြားတော့ရို့သွားတယ်ဒီစိတ်ကမတိုးတော့အဲ့ဒါလိုလည်းဖြစ်တတ်တယ်အခုအတ္တသနာဝိရိယတတိသမารိပညာဒီတရားတွေဟာမိမိရဲ့စိတ်အရှင်မှာကိန်းနေတဲ့ပိုးတွေကိုတကယ်ပယ်တတ်နိုင်တယ်လို့ယုံကြည်ထားပြီမယ်လို့အပြည့်မမီဝဲအချိန်မှမမီဝဲလို့ရှိရင်တော့ကိလေသာပိုးတွေကနောက်ဆုတ်ဘူးကြာတော့ရက်ကနေပြီးတော့လအထိကြာသွားလို့ရှိရင်ဘာမှမထူးတော့ဆေးပေါ်လေတန်တရားတွေဖြစ်တတ်တယ်ဆေးပေးတဲ့ဆရာပေါ်မှာလည်းပဲတန်တရားတွေဖြစ်တတ်တယ်ဒီနည်းနဲ့ပဲစေးစားလည်းမမှန်တော့ဘူးဆိုရင်အဲ့ဒီဆေးကရိုးသွားတယ်မတိုးတော့အဲ့ဒါလေးလည်းပဲသိထားဖို့သိရှိပါတယ်
Another very important point that should especially be noted is that these antibodies should be given at proper times, and the patient should see to it that he or she receives treatment regularly. If there is any negligence on the part of the patient, not turning up for appointments and missing, the injections and vaccinations and so forth, the antibodies which have already been introduced into the physiological system will become very weak. They will no longer have the power to combat the viruses, because the viruses would have built up a resistance in the space of time when the regular dosage was not taken. So within that space of time, the attacking viruses would have made quite good use of the opportunity to build up resistance against the antibodies. And later, eventually, these antibodies will be quite useless if the patient remains negligent. In the same way, in the practice of Satipatthana meditation, regularity and practice according to instructions given by one's teacher is very important. If these are not followed, if there is negligence on the part of the yogi, then that can lead to a build-up of resistance on the part of the Kilesas. The dharmic antibodies of faith, of desire for the Dhamma, of energy, effort, of mindfulness, of concentration, of wisdom, these antibodies will no longer have their required effect. And when one drudges on trying to be mindful in sporadic periods of time according to one's own whims and fancies, then after a month or 2 or 3 or maybe longer than that, one begins to lose faith in the practice, in the method, and in one's teacher. So this point is very important, and it would be really very significant for all of us to ponder upon it.
See, a partly of Masalashi, the yoga chronic kid. Ribrandia will have you did in see such a Mamma Lucy and a yogi, a chronic kid yogi. Who be the Suragaro? The other a serious one is that you, Mayunjida, so so do the Mayunjida, so the Mayunji was a lucy, I told you the Sanamachi, Uria, the Mari Pina, Machi was a lucy. Pilita have a Benina associated with Jan, Eddie Cheto, who you take it how about it.
Finally, if these antibodies become quite ineffective with respect to combating the viruses that have attacked the body, then the patient may become a chronic patient, suffering a chronic disease that will be difficult to cure. And similarly, in the same way, there can also be chronic yogis. People who try to meditate, but in a very sporadic way. They don't really put in total commitment in their practice. And because of their negligence in the practice, because the dharmic antibody of Satipatthana has become ineffective in their practice, then they begin to lose faith in the efficacy of the method, in the efficacy of the dharmic antibodies. And that is the worst thing that can happen. And Sayadaw hopes that all of us will pay special attention to that possibility.
We do the yogi on the Gurega, Yujivida Chi, and Shadow. Who get it, season a Maluade had Bama, Pibu, so that we had a pig in Kitaba. So we need change out of the Modo, Danebe Dojava. See, Mamma, you wear it up. See, never Malu at it. Yoga Pune, do that Kilesas body. That is an idea that the money being out. Kilesas, that's it, the night. That is, says him, I'm young, Yari, Yanni, since him, she got Sichanda, Kuchanda, and everyone, Chanda, Chinayava, Sudam in the Puni,
Well, since the yogis present here are those who have really got faith in Satipatthana meditation, Sayadaw is quite confident that none of the things that he just mentioned will be at all applicable to all of you here. And with that, today, Sayadaw would like to conclude today's talk. He wishes that all of you may be able to take your medicine regularly without neglecting your dosage and the proper times, hoping that with the dharmic antibody properly injected, activated within your bodies and minds, then you will be able to cure yourself of the illness that has been brought about by the viruses called Kilesas or defilements, and that you will eventually become very sound and healthy people.